Hello, world, and thanks for listening to Master English with Tim, the podcast where Tim helps you learn English in depth and detail and without ever hurrying. I'm Tim, native speaker from the United States, English teacher since 2005, world traveler, polyglot, and author of several resources for learning English, including this podcast, now in its 105th episode. Now, at the beginning of each episode, I always say something like, hello world or hello planet, and that is more like something that I hope than something that I'm really sure about. Am I really talking to the whole planet, to the whole world? I'm not really sure. Now, I always thought, honestly, that most of my listeners had to be in just a couple of places. The places I was thinking about were in Eastern Europe, because that's where most of the students I have taught are from, and also from the United States, because that's where I am. But just this week, an interesting thing happened to me, something that made me rethink this. I was visiting the podcasting platform where I publish Master English with Tim, and I was looking at the statistics on how many downloads there had been in the past week. And I saw on that platform a button that said Geography on it. I've been publishing this podcast for over 2 years, but never noticed that button before with Geography written on it. So I clicked on the button and was very, very surprised by what I learned. I was amazed that I had students from all kinds of countries, not just from Eastern Europe and the United States. And the top 3 countries were countries that I really don't think about that much when I think about my podcast. The top 3 countries were Canada, Australia, and Taiwan. And now I'm going to start thinking about these countries a lot more. Not that I didn't think about them before, but I didn't think about them in association with my podcast, and now I do. And in addition to those top 3 of Canada, Australia, and Taiwan, I had listeners from the United States, like I mentioned, Germany, not too surprising, Iran, rather surprising, Spain, Mexico, South Korea, the UK, Japan, Afghanistan, Sweden, Sudan, Brazil, India, Vietnam, Singapore, Lithuania, Romania, New Zealand, Tajikistan, Poland, and finally the Czech Republic, or what nowadays they call Czechia. And you know what? I really appreciate everyone who listens to this podcast. Thank you so much. It really motivates me when I find out that people from so many different places are listening. That's just awesome. Okay, enough of that for the moment. Let's get back to learning and talking about languages, learning them. Of course, you all know me, Tim, as an English teacher, and you all know that this is a podcast about learning English and sometimes also about my travels. But this week, I wanted to share with all of my listeners a different kind of experience. I want to share my own experience not as someone who teaches or gives language to other people, but instead as someone who learns language himself. Now, I know a few foreign languages to a pretty respectable level. I know French, German, Russian, and Spanish, plus a little bit of Polish. So what I'm going to do in this episode is tell you a bit about how I learned one of those languages. In particular, I'm going to tell you how I learned German. So first, why did I learn German? So it's kind of connected actually to how I learned Spanish. So when I was in high school, I took Spanish for 4 years, and afterwards I went to college, and there was a foreign language requirement. And so they said, if you've taken a certain foreign language already, you can satisfy your foreign language requirement by taking that same language, but it has to be in more advanced courses. Now, my level of Spanish was not terrible, but it also wasn't great. And so because I had already taken a rather unusual number of years of Spanish, I was expected to know Spanish to a kind of an intermediate or higher level. And I wasn't really there, to tell you the truth. If I had tried harder, I might have had a different result. And at the time, honestly, I was pretty young and was not super motivated about this kind of stuff. So I decided to take Spanish class, and when I went there, realized that actually it was quite a bit more difficult than I expected, and thought that I wouldn't be able to do it, so I pulled out of the class. I withdrew, and I had to choose something else, and I took out the now very old-fashioned paper course catalog with a list of all the different courses you could take, went to the languages, and there was German, and I just put my finger down, and there it was, German. So that was what I chose. That's why I chose it. Not a great reason, not a terrible reason. It was kind of just a reason, and there it was. I knew that German was going to be harder than Spanish. I didn't really have a clear idea of why I knew that, but it was kind of just the idea that in Spanish, you have a lot of vocabulary that you get for free. That's true of French and Italian and Portuguese. If you are a native English speaker, you kind of automatically know a large amount of vocabulary in those languages without doing any work. Now, if you are a native speaker of a language that is not one of those languages and you don't know French or Spanish or one of those, that fact that the English has so many words in common with, for example, French or Spanish might be kind of surprising, but it's true. So in English, we have all these words that end in I-O-N, like information or confirmation or whatever, and in Spanish, they're all, pretty much the same. Information, información, confirmation, confirmación. And so you can have quite a bit of understanding of Spanish text and to a certain extent from speaking, just using things like that, simple little tricks that give you a very, very strong head start. And I kind of knew intuitively that that was not going to be true of German, and I was right. German vocabulary does overlap with English vocabulary in some important areas, but it's not the kind of thing that you can really rely on. Okay, fish is fish, and man is Mann, and house is Haus. But for the most part, you're not going to get free vocabulary. There are a lot of English words that Germans use, but that's kind of unpredictable. You can't really predict that Germans say creamy instead of sahnig. To me, honestly, all these Anglicisms or English expressions in German, they sound kind of strange when you hear someone speaking German and they replace a completely functional German word with an English one. I don't quite understand why that happens. I don't think it's good or bad, but I find it kind of unpredictable and odd. So yeah, German vocabulary for an English native speaker is not super, super hard, but it's also not easy, definitely not easy. And what about pronunciation? So for the most part, the sounds that you have in English also exist in German and vice versa. So the sounds that you have in German also exist in English. That's not always true though. And so there are some sounds that exist in German that are hard for English native speakers, or at least require some initial effort, and some that kind of continue to cause problems, or at least aesthetic problems. They don't sound good the way you say them as an English speaker. They don't sound German, and in particular, of course, the R sound. That's not particularly easy for English speakers to make. But I'm not someone who tries to speak foreign languages with an accent that sounds like a native. I just really don't care. It's hard for me to learn an accent that's native, or even get close to it, and I don't think it's particularly valuable. And so, high effort, low payoff, no thanks. But I just want to talk about that pronunciation because the pronunciation is what the language consists of. Everything in the language consists of sounds and groups of sounds put together to form words and phrases and sentences and all that. So yeah, German pronunciation is not terribly difficult. Now the grammar. German grammar has a reputation for being extremely difficult, and I don't think that is completely justified. It is true that it is harder to learn than Spanish or French grammar for the most part. There are some people who would argue about this and say, French verbs, Spanish verb tenses, and subjunctive and all this stuff. It's a lot harder than German, because with German verbs and verb tenses, you get to the end and it's finished and that's it. And you don't really have that with Spanish. It just kind of keeps coming. You're in your fourth year or something and they're still talking about verbs. That's true. That is definitely true. But German does have some things that are harder than French or Spanish, and that also keep coming at you. So one, of course, is genders of nouns. There's masculine, feminine, and neuter, and then you also have singular and plural, which is not gender, that's number, but nonetheless, it's another form that you have to put the noun in. And so, the genders you have to memorize or learn somehow, and it's not an easy thing to do. It's not terribly hard. Once you've done it for quite a while, you start to see patterns. You start to understand, okay, if this is a noun that is formed from an irregular verb, it's probably going to be masculine. So beginnen is to begin. Der Beginn is masculine. Or anfangen also means begin, and the noun of it is der Anfang, it's masculine. So you start to see these patterns, and some things are very reliable that indicate what the genders are, so that's not particularly difficult. It is true that you really need to know the genders, and you need to know how the system works, and if you don't, you are going to hit a ceiling. You're going to reach a maximum level of German that's not very high, and you're either going to, well, not speak it very well for the rest of your life, or you're going to go back and fix the problems that you should not have created in the first place by not studying effectively those genders and number and case and all that kind of stuff. German word order is pretty tough for English speakers to learn. It's not terrible. I think that we should really step back when we talk about how difficult a language is. German, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would probably give it about a 3.5 in difficulty. Now you might say, wait a minute, that's absolutely crazy. Well, things can be so much worse. They say in German, schlimmer geht's immer, which means things can always get worse. That's true. I've heard of, for example, the Navajo language, spoken in the southwest of the United States by some Native Americans, and that language is extremely irregular. It's almost completely irregular. It has tones. It has all kinds of verb tenses. It sounds like completely different. The sound sets that the sounds that it uses are very different from the ones in English, and you have all of these different, very difficult things happening at the same time, and almost no one succeeds in doing it. Of course, almost no one actually tries in the first place, but that's to put things in perspective. No, German is not radically, insanely difficult. That's just not true. The words that you hear in speech, you're going to see them on the page, and when you see them on the page, well, you can tell how to pronounce them, which is not true, for example, with English. So, yeah. Another thing about German is, I was saying about word order, and I got a little bit distracted by my own thoughts. Word order in German, is it particularly difficult? It's somewhat difficult. It's more strict than it is in English, and you have to really pay attention to it. The most difficult thing that I think English speakers have in German is the cases. Cases are things like subject, direct object, indirect object, which I talked about several episodes ago. Like in English, we have he is a subject and him is a direct object or indirect object. She, her, me, I, me, we, us, that kind of thing. The changes in forms of words depending on what kind of role or function they play in a sentence. For the most part, German nouns don't do that, but articles do and adjectives do, and that is something you really need to know, or else you will not understand the language well. Also, singular and plural is difficult. It's kind of irregular. Like in English, we have man and men, woman and women, child, children, sheep and sheep, one sheep, many sheep, and you don't always just add a letter S or a sound S or Z to the end of a word in German. Sometimes you do, but there's probably 7 or 8 different ways to make plurals, and you can, after you've learned a lot of words, you can again see patterns, kind of like you did with the verbs. But it's not enough. Sometimes you're going to be wrong, and you've got to know the plural forms. Well, honestly, you don't. You can use the wrong plural form and use something that's close enough. It'll be okay. But if you want to do it really well, then knowing a large number of plural forms is pretty challenging. So I've talked now for quite a while about how difficult German is in three critical areas, pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. But how good is my German? What result did I get? Let's take my result, though, in 2 points in time. So one is at the peak, when my German was at its best, which was, now over 20 years ago, and right now. So let's talk first about speaking. So at my peak, in 20 years ago or so, when my German was at its best, I could speak and have a really solid conversation if someone wanted to talk with me. And that was not always the case. People didn't always want to talk to me, and that's normal. Now my speaking is significantly worse, but it's not bad. I'm a very lucky person in the sense that when I learn a language, I don't really forget it. I can forget things, some things, but, have difficulty remembering some other ones, but for the main part of it stays with me. So my speaking was pretty solid, and it still is pretty solid. Reading, this was always the strong thing. This was always what I was best at, and my reading level is still pretty solid, and it was back then too. Writing, a little bit weaker, and listening, well, it depends on the accent. Listening always is my weak point in every language that I learn, because I like to read a lot, and I'm not a super sociable person. That might surprise you from listening to this podcast. I'm talking to all kinds of people, so Tim must be super sociable. Honestly, not really. So I kind of read a lot and don't talk to other people a ton, and so listening is not my strong point. That might not be the only reason, though. So if someone is speaking in, classic High German, I understand them typically pretty well. If someone is from Bavaria, and they're still speaking High German, but with their Bavarian accent, Southern Germany, I really miss a lot. It's much, much harder for me. So I told you about my result, which is actually pretty respectable. I would give myself right now probably a B2 or so in speaking, and I could, after a couple of weeks of practice, bring it up much higher. Maybe not much higher. I'd probably get to, C1. And in the other areas, B2 or C1 right now. So how did I get that result, though? So let me tell you the story of how I learned German. I mentioned earlier that I changed from studying Spanish to studying German. That happened way back in 1999, and it happened because I was not a great student in Spanish. I should have tried harder and just, worked with the more difficult material. And I didn't do that, so I changed to German, but that wasn't any easier. So I had to just face the music, face the difficulty, and try to learn it. And so in 1999, I took my first German class, and I was lucky because I had a professor. His name was Steve, and Steve was a very serious grammar teacher and vocabulary, and he really wanted us to know the language well. And if you didn't know everything that he taught you, he would not give you an A, which is completely fair. That's the way it should be, and I respected him for that. At the same time, I was not a great student, and it was only towards the end of the semester that I started to understand that, okay, this language is more difficult than I thought it would be, and that time is running out, and I need to start working. So I did. I started working really hard on my German, and I managed to pull my grade up and get about a C or C+, something like that. The next semester, I had a different professor or teacher, and that guy, super nice guy, he gave very good classes, but he graded more softly. And so I got the idea kind of from his classes because I got a good grade, not an amazing one, but a decent, respectable grade. I got the idea that my German must be, pretty good. And in fact, it wasn't. I had not learned very effectively. And so at the end of that semester, I had to make a decision whether I was going to continue German or not, because we had a foreign language program that, allowed us to, at that university, to travel to another country and finish, the foreign language requirement. Typically, a person would take 2 semesters at home and then 1 semester in a different country. And so that's what I did. I went to Germany, but before I did that, I kind of realized that I needed to learn to speak better. So what did I do to fix my speaking problem? Well, I hadn't really spoken much German at all, so what I did was something very primitive and kind of embarrassing, actually. I got a bunch of paper cards and made paper vocabulary cards. And to my credit, on one side, I wrote the English, and on the other side, I wrote the German with the singular and the plural if it was a noun, and the gender, and I learned the forms of the words. I memorized them using the cards. The thing is, using cards does not, that situation, you sitting alone, or even with another person reviewing cards, does not resemble a conversation in any way. Has nothing to do with it. And so when I got to Germany, I pretty unsurprisingly started to speak German with people and, did not understand what they were saying back to me. If I asked for what I wanted for and did it correctly the first time, I would probably get what I wanted and not have to speak anymore. If I didn't explain it successfully, then the person would ask me what I meant, and I didn't understand, and then I was lost, and then they would have to speak English to me, and it kind of made me feel a little bit like, why am I doing this exactly? Everybody speaks English, but I'm stubborn, That's very helpful. Stubborn, by the way, if you don't understand stubborn, if a person is stubborn, that means that they do not easily change their way of thinking or their habits. If they do something one way, they continue to do it. Someone else says, no, that's not a great idea. And they say, no, I do it this way, and that's it. So if I've started to do something, for example, learn German, I continue to do it. I just keep going and going and going, and that really helped me. So for about 2 weeks, I traveled around in Germany and, spoke rather ineffective German and learned some things from street signs and so on, but really my German didn't get much better. And then the classes started, and I again had that same professor teacher who was, quite strict grader and really wanted us to know what he was teaching, Steve, and he was my teacher again. And so I had classes with him, and that again motivated me. I had to have some discipline. I had to really learn what was being taught to me, and so I really just studied harder. It doesn't mean I got a great grade, but I did get better. Now, the one thing that really helped me was that in that program, you would have a roommate, from the United States that you lived with, and they would take the two of you, yourself and your roommate, and give you to a conversation partner. And that conversation partner would speak German with you. Now, some people weren't very lucky and they got a conversation partner who wanted to speak English and get paid for it, but that's not what happened with myself and my roommate. So I got a very nice conversation partner. Her name was Alex, and Alex was one of those people that you don't think about it at the time, but they kind of change your life a little bit. So at that point in my German studies, I could have either continued or not continued. I could have finished the German program, and said to myself, you know what, okay, that's the foreign language requirement, and okay, I got my grades that I needed, they weren't great, and I'm going to move on. Or I could have said, this is interesting, let me keep going. And that's the second thing. That second option is what I actually took, and I can say that it was to a large extent because of Alex. She would put myself and my roommate together, and we would talk. And in the beginning, it was quite difficult. But soon, and actually surprisingly soon, I started to speak German a lot better. I could have simple conversations, say things, sometimes have a little bit of humor that would make people laugh. And I surprised myself because I really did not expect it. My grades were not amazing. They weren't terrible, but they weren't amazing either. And so I really started to speak a lot more. And I knew that there was a lot more to know, but still, I had made a huge improvement, and that's what made me sign up for the next semester of German, so to continue after the requirement that the university had. And so for another couple years, actually, I continued using those classes, and it was typically classes that would meet 3 or 4 times a week, and they were kind of traditional. There was some translation, there was a lot of grammar, not a huge focus on vocabulary, and that came back actually to be a bit of a problem later. So in 2002, I went to Berlin on my own to do a little history research program that I was invited to, and actually, these were 2 other people that had a huge impact on my German. It shows again that, a few people can make a huge difference in your life and in your language studies. So I'm a big bike riding guy. I love to ride my bike. And I brought my bike with me to Berlin. I would love to do tricks and jump and do stuff like this. And so I was riding down the street, and I saw 2 guys on nice bikes, and I just approached them and started talking to them. And they were kind of uncomfortable, it seemed, but no, they were not pushing me away. And they said, you want to ride with us down the street? So I rode down the street with them, and they said, we're going to show you a secret place where people do tricks and jumps and stuff. So they took me there, and along the way, they said, so Tim, do we know you? You said your name is Tim. Do we know you? And I said, no. And they said, well, why were you talking to us? And I just said, well, you have cool bikes. You seem like nice people. And I realized that in Germany, you don't really do that. You don't just walk up to people or ride up to them on your bike and just start talking to them and become friends with them. Well, I didn't know that. And because I didn't know that, I was able to do it. So I kept in contact with those people. And with one of them, I'm still in contact with them occasionally. That's now a long, long time ago, 23 years. And so I, hung out with both of them several times while I was there, and went back to the United States and took even more German courses. By this time, I was almost ready to graduate and decided to add German as a second focus in my studies, a second specialization. I only had to take a few more courses to get that on my diploma, and so I decided to do it, even though it would make me study there for like another 6 months, another year, which, is not great to keep going in college when you should get out and probably earn some money. It's not a terrible thing, but I would have liked to have had the extra salary from that year. In any case, I took German instead of that, and the courses were a lot more advanced, and they were pretty effective, honestly. I mean, they were partly because there were just a lot of them. It was more grammar, some vocabulary, and kind of traditional, but, it did the trick. Oh, there was one person that I forgot to mention about my 2002 trip to Berlin. There was the woman that hosted me that, I lived in her apartment, and that was the kind of person where if I had met her earlier, I might have stopped studying German, where you're on the edge. You've got to decide, will I continue, not continue? If I had met her instead of Alex at that critical moment a couple years earlier, I might have stopped. She wasn't super unpleasant, but, it wasn't a great experience with her either. She just was kind of cold, and we initially had a really nice night out when I first went there. She was, probably in her 50s or so, and I could have a really good introductory German conversation, but after that, my German was honestly not great. So it was kind of difficult to communicate with her, and she was kind of frustrated with me a lot and would make kind of unpleasant remarks about the country where I was from, which I didn't really appreciate. It happens. Sometimes you run into people that aren't super pleasant. So after I went back to the United States, so, I said I took those courses. There were some literature courses, and the one thing was that there was not very much practical vocabulary. There was not a lot of vocabulary about day-to-day life, and there was not a lot of, for example, newspapers. It was textbook stuff. And so at the end of the year, I got a scholarship, a grant to study in Germany for an entire year, go back to Berlin. And that's what I did. I went to Berlin again in the summer of 2003, and I had a few weeks to continue to study German before classes started. And so while I was living in Berlin, I got a roommate, I got a nice apartment, and I decided to buy a paper newspaper because they were common back then. And it was like €1.30 or something. And I opened the newspaper and realized I didn't understand it, and that I had a few weeks before classes were going to start. And so I luckily had my German dictionary with me, big thick paper thing that people never use anymore. And I did something that other exchange students did not do, which is that I made a subscription. I bought a subscription to a German newspaper and read it every single day. The first days that I did it took me 7, even 8 hours. I would have to, get up in the morning, study for 4 hours, take a break, and then do it again. And I was really kind of afraid and desperate because I knew that classes were going to start soon, and I had to know how to read the texts that I was going to be reading. I also had gotten, before this, I had gotten kind of the false idea that my ability to read German was very strong, because during my historical research program, I was reading books that were written by a couple of authors. They were German soldiers or officers who went to the United States and fought in the American Civil War, and I was writing about them. And so the vocabulary actually was not super difficult. And so I thought, well, I've read a German book, and that means that I can read German books in general. That's really not true. That's very mistaken thinking. And so the newspaper thing shocked me, and it really forced me to continue to study so I could take part successfully in my classes. And at the same time, another thing that I did was I tried to read about one book per week. So at the same time that I was reading these newspapers, cover to cover, every single day, including on Sundays when the newspaper's super thick, and the sports section, which I honestly don't care about, and looking back, think was a waste of time. While I was doing that, I was also reading a book or so per week. While in the subway, I spent a lot of time in the subway going to 2 different universities I was studying at, one of which, the free university, was pretty far from where I lived. It was like about a 45-minute ride in the metro, just too far. And so I used the time, though, to read, and it really improved my vocabulary a lot. Also, at the beginning of that exchange semester, when everybody was registering to become a student and registering with the university, all this stuff, you could see students from all these different countries coming in, and I could see immediately what was happening. I could see, there's French people, and the French people are talking to each other because they felt nervous and alone and, away from home and speaking French to each other now, and then Spanish people doing the same thing, and I thought, that's going to lead to bad places or places that I don't want to go. That place, of course, is, one where you get to the end of the exchange year and you realize that your language level has not improved at all because you spent the entire time with a bunch of people who speak your own language. So I deliberately, intentionally avoided that situation and did not have any English-speaking friends. I kind of stopped using English. That's kind of an extreme thing to do, but that's pretty much what I did. My 2 bike friends, I also continued to hang out with them, and that helped a lot. I mean, we would go ride bikes, and we would, have some beers and some pizza or whatever, ride in the subway or the U-Bahn to get to where we were riding, possibly, or to come back. And, so that involved speaking German for large parts of the day, and it really helped a lot. Also, I had a friend who was, one of those 2 guys was very talkative on the telephone, so he would call me up, and it was at times when I was like, man, I just want to go to bed, and he would call me up and want to talk, and I was like, oh, okay, fine, I'll talk to him. A really nice guy, super nice guy, but at times I was tired, and I said, I'm just going to talk to him anyway, and did, and it really helped my German a lot also, just constantly talking. I was very fortunate, not many people get that kind of chance, but I also did create that opportunity for myself, whereas those other exchange students, most of them did not. I did have one other exchange student friend who kind of had a similar strategy, and we kind of played ping pong with each other, if you will. He was from Finland. He might be listening now. His name was Antti, and his German would get a little bit better than mine, and then I would get better than his, and we kind of competed. It was fun, and we both got a great result. We were probably the best German speakers, with one possible exception, out of all the exchange students that we knew, which was quite a lot of people. I had to make presentations in my classes in German, and that was not easy. I had to listen to lectures in German, and I understood what was happening, what the professor was saying. For the most part, there were times when my listening comprehension was not as great, and that was, kind of frightening because you thought, well, I'm going to have a test on this at some point. Now, what's going to happen? Making the presentation myself, the first semester, did not go great because I just was very nervous, and I just read from a piece of paper. I read my presentation from a piece of paper, and I got, a C. And I shouldn't have done that, but I had kind of complexes because sometimes it's hard to get German speakers to speak German with you. Now, if you're listening to this and you're German, you might think, oh, that's not true, that's not true of me, but in my experience, it really is true. Not of everyone, but it happens quite a bit where you're an English speaker and you speak German with someone, and they don't want to speak German with you. They want to speak English, and so they tell you your accent is bad or something, or they just ignore you until you start speaking English, and then they're your best friends suddenly. And so I was too nervous to make the presentations, and that was an opportunity that I passed up. So the second semester, things went a little bit better in that regard, and so I did make a better presentation. I would say that most of my improvement came not from those classes, history classes, although they were helpful, but from talking with people, reading the newspaper, reading books, listening to the radio to a certain extent. That was helpful. I did not watch a lot of movies. I had a roommate who was actually very, very hard to get. It was very hard to get him to speak German, and he was kind of condescending. If a person is condescending, they think that they're better than you, but they kind of help you because you need the help. And my German was actually pretty good, but he was very hard to understand. German has dialects, and the dialects are kind of different from each other. Some of them are basically different languages. The Berlin dialect is still basically High German, but it's spoken more quickly. The pronunciation's different. And it was hard to understand the guy. He would say unpredictable stuff in very short sentences and then not say anything more. I think he didn't particularly like me. It was not a good match. It was not a match made in heaven. And so, I didn't learn a lot there because he had the TV in the apartment and he wanted to watch English movies, and he watched English movies. He had English movie night every Monday. Through him, though, I did meet another bike person, and we would hang out, and he and I would speak German. He respected my German ability, and his English was also pretty good. He might be listening to. His name is Martin. Hi, Martin. Hope you're doing great. And so by the end of that period, those 2 semesters, my German was really good. And my Finnish friend, Antti, the one I played German ping pong with, getting better, and then he was better, he told me, hey, Tim, there's this interesting opportunity. There's a German test that you can take. It was the DFH, Deutschprüfung für den Hochschulzugang. So that's a German test for university access. So if you passed this test, you could actually, in theory, go to a German university, and they would say, well, what's your German level? How are you going to study? And you just say, well, here's the certificate. And you can do that for the rest of your life. So I really really liked that idea. I didn't know exactly what the certificate did, but it sounded great, and I took the test with Auntie by my side, and we both got really solid grades on it. And that was probably the peak of my German, maybe a little bit afterwards. That was July 2004, and I stayed for a little bit longer, and by that time I could really speak quite well. Did I know every single word? No. Did I need to search for words sometimes? Yes, absolutely. But was I at my peak? Definitely. And was it pretty respectable? I would say definitely yes. Okay, so that's the story of how I learned German, and there are some lessons I think that I learned here. And so I'd say there are 4 of them. One of them is that meeting the right people is that's an important thing to do. You meet the wrong people, it will hurt your motivation, and you might stop studying the language just because of some bad people. Don't let that happen. And that brings me to my next point. Being stubborn is helpful. Not changing. Not giving up, even when things are very difficult. Just keep going and keep going and keep going. It doesn't have to be, 8 hours a day like I talked about. That was kind of an extreme situation. But continuing even when you think there's no progress, that's a really important thing. And I'd say probably in general. Of course, it can go the wrong way where you continue doing something that's bad for you, but studying a language is probably not bad for you. Third lesson would be reading a lot. You don't have to do that. People learn languages in different ways, but that was my way of learning lots and lots of vocabulary. People consistently told me, wow, you have a really good vocabulary. I don't know where you learn these words from. I've never seen those in a textbook. And I didn't find them in textbooks. I found them in newspapers. I found them in books that I was reading. They could be fiction. They could be nonfiction. The key thing was reading things that I could understand and that I enjoyed. So that brings me to my next point, the 4th point, vocabulary. Again, this doesn't have to be the way that you learn, but a language consists of words, and you do need to know the grammar, you do need to know the pronunciation, but if you're talking about speaking, knowing a lot of words definitely helps you, and it doesn't have to be by speaking that you learn them. You can learn them from reading, you can learn them however you want. Vocabulary, and that is one of the reasons that I think that I came to the NGSL, the New General Service word list that I'm always pushing in my podcasting. You should learn these 2,800 words and learn all the different meanings of these words. That is something that was really missing in my German studies, and really in all language studies that I had. No one systematically said, here's all the vocabulary, learn all this stuff and learn these different meanings, just go for it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if you just read it, even if you just read through the thing and understand all of these meanings and definitions and words, then you'll already have a big improvement. That didn't happen, and that was something that was missing. So vocabulary is super important. Meet the right people. Be stubborn. If you like reading, read a lot. If you like movies, then watch a bunch of movies. And so everyone, that is how I learned German, and those are the lessons that I learned from it. And I think I've been talking for quite a while right now, probably around 30 minutes. Not sure, haven't counted it up. And so I think it's probably time to stop. I really enjoyed this episode. I hope you did too. I know that it's not a usual topic. This is an English podcast about learning English, and so here I am talking about German, which is odd, but I enjoyed doing it. I hope you enjoyed listening. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next Monday. Thank you.